Thank everybody for joining us. Mark Weathington, the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. This is a really special midweek program because we've got a live studio audience, which is new for us. So we're really excited about that. Feel free to put your questions in the chat if you're on Zoom. Feel free to raise your hand if you're in the live studio audience, and we'll get your questions as we go along, or you can hold them to the end. So I've always been fascinated by how plants move around the world, how they change culture, things like that. The example I like to give to people is, the question, why does Chicago dye its river green for St. Patrick's Day? And, that starts with potatoes that grow in the Andean mountains of South America, where it's cool and damp, which were collected and brought back to Europe, and they grew so well in Ireland that they became the primary food source, which led to the diseases and the great potato famine and mass migration to the U.S. from Ireland, and a lot of those people wound up in Chicago for various reasons, and so now St. Patrick's Day is a big holiday there. So, there's a lot more details in there that you can get into, but it's, plants and how they move really do change the world. So I want to talk about holiday spices, because they're spices that we all, most of us know and use. But the first thing is, what is a spice? And I thought I knew what a spice was. I had always said a spice is a plant part that's used for flavoring or dyeing foods that's separate from the leaves of the plants. But I looked at Merriam-Webster. Their definition is any of various aromatic vegetable products used to season or flavor foods. So that's a much broader, that's kind of everything. That includes what I would call herbs. Wikipedia, the source of all information, right, says it's a seed, fruit, root, bark, or other plant substance primarily used for flavoring or coloring food. Spices are distinguished from herbs, which are the leaves, flowers, or stems of plants used for flavoring or as a garnish. So that's more what I always thought. But there is a more official definition, at least for those of us here in the U.S. According to the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, labeling, lots of federal regulations, but this is labeling. The term spice means any aromatic vegetable substance in the whole, broken, or ground form, except for those substances which have been traditionally regarded as foods, such as onions, garlic, and celery, whose significant function in food is seasoning rather than nutritional, that is true to name, and from which no portion of any volatile oil or other flavoring principle has been removed. So that is the official definition. So when you buy a spice, that is what it means, for whatever that's worth. So, but they're the things in bottles in your spice cabinet. Is what it is. So, there were all kinds of ones I wanted to talk about. I can't talk about them all in the amount of time they had. So I just picked some that I especially like. And the first is cinnamon. And, we probably know cinnamon. You've seen it in these little curled up pieces. Looks a lot different from most other spices. That's because it's the bark of the tree, which is a little bit more unusual in terms of where we're getting our flavorings from. I assume everybody knows what cinnamon tastes like. So there are many species of cinnamon. It's in the laurel family, so the Lauraceae family. Lots of plants in this family. Many of them are evergreen trees or shrubs, and the cinnamomum are trees and shrubs. There's only a few species that are used for as cinnamon. The original and what's considered true cinnamon is from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh kind of area, and called Cinnamomum verum, with cinnamomum for cinnamon, and verum means true. So it was the original one. More common, especially if you're getting it ground, what we will get in the U.S. is a Chinese cinnamomum called Cinnamomum Cassia, which is a slightly different species. And I'll tell you some of the distinguishing features between the most common cinnamons in a minute. So cinnamon has been used for a long time. We know it was recorded as being in Egypt in as early as 2000 BCE. So the different ones. So the Sri Lankan cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, sometimes known as Cinnamomum zeylanicum. When you get it, you will usually get it in these quills, these rolled up quills. It is very brittle, easy to break. It's often got little pieces broken out there. And if you look at the ends, it's layered. You can see these very thin layers in there. And that's generally considered the best for flavoring, especially fresh foods, things like that. The Chinese cinnamon, which again is more often, you'll find ground more often, is holds up better to cooking. So it's used often for cooking. So Cinnamomum cassia, the Chinese type. That you will never see in these curled up quills of cinnamon. It's the bark is too hard. It won't curl up like this. So if you see it in whole form, it'll be in kind of chunks and pieces of bark, not like this. If you get it whole, probably shouldn't put it through your spice grinder or anything like that, because it can do a number on it, because it's like, putting some, wood chips through the grinder. There's some other ones. There's one that you often see as Corinci cinnamon, also known as Indonesian cinnamon, Padang cassia. This is Cinnamomum burmannii. When you get your cinnamomum in quills, so this is it ground, which you can get that way. But if you get it in quills, this is the other one that you'll find this way, it will be very tough. You really have to snap it, and it'll be one layer. It's not that multi-layered, more brittle, true cinnamon. So that's how you can tell the difference. There is also one, if you see Vietnamese cinnamon or Saigon cinnamon, that's another species. And that's another one that if you get whole, like the Chinese cinnamon, it'll be chunks and pieces rather than fine. But really, you don't want to put any of these through a spice grinder except for the true cinnamon. These quills, because they're so hard, they can do a number on them as well. So if you want ground cinnamon, you might as well get the already ground or get the true cinnamon. So cinnamon is, the way it's grown, it's a tropical plant, so it grows very fast. So usually tree is planted, it grows for 2 or 3 years, and then it's coppiced, meaning it's cut down low, and then it puts out new shoots that come up, and those new shoots are what's harvested, and they take off the bark, and it's just this inner layer of bark that's used for the cinnamon. So it can be a pretty labor-intensive project to get this stuff, and then you have to process it immediately. You can't. There's no hanging around with it. It's got to be done while the inner bark is still wet. They scrape off the outer bark. They beat the branch. If you've ever seen like cork production where they beat the tree trunks, it's like that, but on a much tinier scale. And then they pry it off in these long rolls. This is the true cinnamon, and this Indonesian cinnamon, they do this. for the true cinnamon, it's like 0.5 millimeters thick or smaller, so very small. And then it dries very quickly. Just less than half a day, it's dried, and as long as it's well ventilated, dry environment. All the culinary ones are too tender for us to grow in much of the U.S. Here in the Piedmont of North Carolina, in our Zone 7B climate, here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, we've grown several for many years. We've grown Cinnamomum japonicum for 30 years. We've grown Cinnamomum wilsonii for 20 years. These are all Chinese species. Cinnamomum jensennianum for about 20 years. And they all make, really beautiful evergreen kind of pyramidal trees. They're very easily distinguished, these plants in the Lauraceae, many of these plants in the Lauraceae family, especially the ones that are the Cinnamomums and the ones closely related. They'll have three generally, a midrib and then two very distinct, sometimes four very distinct veins that go from the base almost all the way up to the tip of the leaf. So it's a very, very distinct leaf rather than that netted veination you see in most. Flowers are yellowish to greenish, small, not very showy in most species, although some are a little bit showier. And then they're followed by kind of blue-black fruit. Little marble to smaller size. Usually have green stems while they're young, but often they're very difficult to distinguish one from another, and so it often depends on if you know where it was originally grown. One of the interesting things about the use of ground cinnamon, now I wouldn't get expensive ground cinnamon for this, is as an antifungal agent in plants. If you do a lot of dividing of things which are easily susceptible to getting fungal diseases, if you dust with cinnamon before repotting them or replanting, that can often do a good job of keeping them from having issues. And a lot of nurseries that grow kind of more unusual things, you'll often see somewhere in a workspace, big old, Costco, Sam's Club container of ground cinnamon that they'll use to dust plants with. And I've seen people dust seeds with it. I've seen people who store tender bulbs using that. Sulfur is often used the same way, but wouldn't you rather use cinnamon than sulfur? Smells much better. And again, this is a pretty popular spice worldwide. You're looking at almost 250,000 tons of cinnamon a year, and cinnamon's not real heavy, so because it's completely dry. So it's kind of a neat spice, and it's one of the spices that did not all originate from the Spice Islands, but several of these other ones I'll talk about did. The Moluccas, the Spice Islands, including this next one, which is cloves. Cloves are these little things. They look like a little. Let me spread these out. A little. Straight piece, and then a little star-shaped thing with a round bit on top. So these are actually flower buds, believe it or not. This is the flower bud of a tree called Syzygium aromaticum. They are aromatic, and they're native to the Spice Islands. The Moluccas, or now I think more people are saying Molucca Islands, which is the native name. It's an evergreen tree, grows to 25, 40 feet tall, real pretty plant, big leaves, and the flowers are really bright red on most selections of them. And they're in terminal clusters. It's a real showy thing. Now, This spice that we get, the whole cloves, is actually the bud of the flower. So this is the flower stalk, the little short straight piece. And then these, the little 4-star pieces on there are the sepals of the flower, and then the round part is the unopened flower bud. So it is the actual flower bud. So kind of neat thing. It's there, as the name Syzygium aromaticum says, very aromatic, which is nice. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, apparently the Han Chinese emperors required that you chew a clove, a whole clove before addressing them, so you wouldn't have bad breath. I would eat one right now, except for I ate one right before we started this, and my breath is still very, very fresh from it because it's a powerful flavor when eaten raw. I think that was just a weird flex from the emperors to make people eat these things. By the 1st century, in the Common Era, they had made it to Rome. Pliny the Elder described them. That's a lot of times the first source we have for their a lot of plants that traveled in that area is Pliny the Elder. We have grown a hardy form before. A lot of places will grow it, Syzygium buxifolium, the box leaf Syzygium. And it's fairly hardy, zone 8 kind of plant, really nice evergreen plant. The Syzygium, the genera name means like joined or conjoined, and it's because they have little opposite leaves on the stems, and it looks like they're kind of joined. But if you're a bonsai grower, the Syzygium buxifolium is a plant that you often see being sold for bonsai. Both of these, cinnamon and cloves, in the U.S. especially, we really think of them as flavorings for sweet things a lot of times, pumpkin pies, this is all the, pumpkin pie spice and things like that, cinnamon buns, other desserts. But in a lot of other cultures, Asian cultures especially, these are used a lot more in savory dishes. And if you don't add sugar to them, they're great in savory dishes. They give a lot of warmth to like stews and chilies and things like that. So think about that when you're using them. Now the next one is kind of interesting because a lot of people know it but don't realize it's related to a native plant that we have here in the U.S. This is star anise. This is the really was used as a cheaper alternative to true anise. But star anise, Alyssium verum. Alyssium means to entice, and verum, again, means true, like the Cinnamomum verum. Really nice kind of licorice scent to it. But this is a kind of a pretty large, medium to large evergreen tree in native to mostly Vietnam and southwest China. It has beautiful strappy-petaled, star-shaped pink to red flowers. And many people probably grown Alyssium or anise tree, anise shrub, whatever. Alyssium verum is tropical, but there are other species that we grow. Quick thing before we go on, because there's a lot of species. This is the seed pod from Alyssium verum, the star anise spice. This is not toxic. Every other Alyssium, as far as I am aware, certainly our native ones and the main other ones, Alyssium anisatum, that we grow in landscapes, are toxic, very toxic. Don't eat them. So if somebody says, I collected some of my own star anise, do not eat. The other species are come from U.S., Mexico. The Arboretum introduced one called Alyssium mexicanum Aztec Fire for the large red flowers that we collected in Mexico, and then all over a good bit of Asia. I've got a few examples of them, and these are 3 different species. And if you look carefully, this one, Alyssium lanceolatum, has more lanceolate leaves. This one, Alyssium parviflorum, kind of broader, more rounded leaves. And this Alyssium anisatum, kind of a little bit smaller leaves, but wider and shorter than lanceolatum. And the other species tend to have white to pink to red flowers. There are some yellow flowered species as well. Most are pretty good size evergreen shrubs. Very deer resistant because all the species have very aromatic foliage, and deer will leave them alone almost always. Always put in that little disclaimer caveat, because it's deer will eat anything. A real interesting thing about this plant, this is up until 2012, the pharmaceutical company that makes Tamiflu, remember Tamiflu, and that was a big deal for a while. They used 90% of the crop of star anise to make, it was kind of an intermediate step in making Tamiflu, making a specific acid, which I think is kind of cool. But they don't do that anymore. There's a new bacterial method that makes that intermediate acid much easier. This is one of my favorite herbs because it is critical for the making of real Vietnamese pho or pho, P-H-O, with a little mark over it. This is one of the critical taste elements. It's also used a lot it's used in 5-spice powder in China, one of my favorite seasonings. It's used heavily in biryani and some other Indian dishes. So, and it's really used a lot with meats as well. So where the cloves and cinnamon are a little more associated with sweet things, star anise a little more associated with the savory side of things. It's beautiful when floated around in stews and things. The nice thing about some of these bigger spices, people all pull these out of their dishes. I like to leave the cinnamon chunks and star anise in things when I serve them. Most people are smart enough not to eat them. Cloves are a little bit small to leave in. Those are harder to eat around in dishes, but they're great. There are, as I mentioned, there are a lot of more hardy temperate forms out there. We're currently growing 29 different selections and 11 species here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. In part, we've been collecting them because we've been working with breeders who are using them, but also just because they are so deer resistant, and that's something that everybody's looking for. Now, certainly the most widely known and used spice that I will talk about here is black pepper. And people don't really, think about this as such a common thing that people don't even really think about it much being a spice at all. It is the world's most heavily traded, highest volume traded spice. It's like 1.2 billion tons of pepper are traded, shipped around the world now. At one point, it was really worth literally more than its weight in gold. It was only for the very rich. So there is common misconception that pepper was used in Europe to cover the taste, whatever, of meat that was going bad. And that is just simply not true. People who can afford to purchase something that's worth its weight in gold aren't eating spoiled meat, and the people who might be subject to spoiled meat don't have access to pepper. And, the people there were a lot closer to the land than we were. And really, people knew what rotten meat did to you, spoiled meat, and generally did not eat spoiled meat because going hungry is a lot better than being that sick. So, somewhere that got started, and it has persisted and persisted, maybe because salt is a preservative. There are some preservative properties with pepper, but not in the same range as like a salt and some other things. So, and it would have been expensive then to do that with. Now, interestingly, like most of these things, people have no idea what pepper comes from. Pepper, Piper nigrum, it's black pepper, literally is an evergreen vine. It grows to about 15 feet tall or so, and is actually a really beautiful vine. The fruit is a little what they call a drupe botanically. So any of your stone fruits like peaches and nectarines are drupes. That means they have one seed in the middle and then a fleshy coating around the outside. So when they're harvested, what you mostly get, the black pepper. The black pepper is the fruit that is cooked and dried, unripe fruit. So this is fruit that hasn't ripened up yet. When it ripens, it goes from kind of a greenish color to more red. So cooked and dried unripe fruit. Green pepper, if you get green pepper, that's dried unripe fruit, but not cooked. And both of those have the fleshy layer on there just dried out. That's why you got kind of that wrinkled skin on black pepper, and if you kind of roll it around, that'll come off and leave you with a little shell in there. White pepper is ripe seeds. So that's the peppercorn that's gotten ripe, but the skin has been removed from that. So that's where the difference is. And they all have a different flavor. If you're really lucky and you're in areas near where they produce pepper, you can get true red pepper, not spicy red pepper, but red pepper nigrum. But that's the ripe fruit that's fresh. It does not ship, does not store for more than a couple of days, so you don't get that. Now, am I skipping any? Ask my live studio audience. There's pink peppercorns, right? That is not a pepper. That's a completely different genus, completely different family. That is what's from the Peruvian pepper tree, which is Schinus, SCH, mole, or Schinus terebinthifolius, which is in the Anacardiaceae family, which is the same family as poison ivy, but also cashews, and mangoes. So if you're somebody who has a reaction to cashews or mangoes, you might want to stay away from pink peppercorns because they can give you that same reaction. They've been around for a long time. They were found stuffed in the nostrils of Ramses II as part of the mummification ritual. So that was 1200 before the Common Era. Cinnamon is actually also used in the mummification process traditionally. We grow here at the Arboretum two different peppers, two different Piper. One of them has a big leaf, one called Piper auritum that kind of spreads underground, has stems that come up, flowers, like all peppers do, with these narrow, very thin spikes of white, closely densed flowers. You'd never know they were a flower if somebody probably didn't tell you or you looked at them under a microscope, because they just look like kind of solid white little things coming out. But those will form the peppers on there. The other one we grow is a vine like Piper nigrum. This is Piper cadsura. The form we grow is a variegated one that's known as Pied Piper, which we didn't think would be hardy, but has been growing for us for 20 years in the Arboretum. So we've grown it for a long time. We moved some, put it over a wall where it's been allowed to kind of cascade over and grow up. And I noticed earlier this season that as opposed to the typical heart-shaped leaves that you get, some of the leaves were losing that very heart-shaped look to them. And so I thought, well, these leaves might be becoming mature. And sure enough, when I looked, you probably can't see this, probably nobody but me can see this. There are little flower buds on here. So this is the first year that that we've put our pepper in a right position to flower. So we're hoping that in the spring, those buds will open up and really be, it's actually quite showy. I've seen the species in the wild and they have kind of yellowy white flowers, and growing up a tree, they kind of hung off all over the place. So now we get to the single most exotic spice in your spice cabinet. It is one that probably some people who've been around me a while have heard me talk about. Certainly, if somebody mentions this spice in my household, my children and my wife groan audibly because they know what they're going to hear. So, this is it. The most exotic spice. There's a reason why it comes one to a container often. This is vanilla. Somewhere along the way, vanilla became synonymous with boring and bland and common. Probably because they didn't dye vanilla ice cream blue and left it white. But vanilla became synonymous with boring. And I'm going to tell you why it's not. The first thing is, vanilla is mostly derived from a plant called Vanilla planifolia, the flat-leafed vanilla. Vanilla is an orchid. It is a vining orchid. So how many other orchids are you eating out there? Not many. Orchids are always, kind of exotic. So, but that's not the whole reason, is that it's really difficult to get these pods to you. So vanilla was first discovered as as far as we know, as something used from Mexico. Vanilla planifolia grows Mexico and Central America, and it was used by the Aztecs. The name vanilla derives from a word that's little pod, because what we're eating is the seed pod of vanilla. So when you hear vanilla beans, they're not actually beans, because you don't get beans from orchids, but it is the orchid pod. So it's a vine, I said, and vanilla vines will grow as far as you'll let them. They are vigorous vines. Now, if they grow really vigorously and really tall, they don't produce many flowers. So growers always take them and they fold the plants down so the plants stay in accessible heights, but that also keeps them flowering. It's, kind of like the manipulation that you see with grape growers to get the most grapes and other fruit growers to get the most out of them. And they also want to be able to harvest and do everything they need to do from a standing position. Now, it was discovered by a botanist in Veracruz who had this growing, that there was a little bee that kept visiting it and pollinating it. And what was found through much study is that there is a single genus of bee that will pollinate vanilla orchids. And that's, if you know your bees, that's Eulema is the genus of these solitary bees that will pollinate them. There are some other claims that some hummingbirds and other things do, but none of those have been actually substantiated, although they will visit the flowers. So, you get these pods and you can scrape out the seeds. That's where the oily seeds, that's where most of the flavor is. But, if you do that, you don't want to throw away the pod. You throw it in something to get that flavor out, because these things are pretty pricey. There are some other vanilla species from other places like Tahiti, Vanilla pompona and Tahitiensis. But most vanilla is grown now in Indonesia and Madagascar, and most of it's the planifolia. So here's what, it's not that it's an orchid that makes it so exotic. It is getting this this thing to you. The orchids, even if they are where these orchid bees grow naturally, they only have a 1% chance of successful pollination. The flowers actually have both male and female parts in the same flower, but it's separated by a little membrane. And so they're functionally self-sterile. So 1%, even where the bees are there. So all vanillas, every vanilla pod that you see is hand pollinated by a person. Think about that. It was actually a 12-year-old slave on Reunion Island who developed the method that's still pretty much what's used, and that's you take a little piece of bamboo, or sometimes there's something a little bit metal nowadays. Somebody goes in, lifts the membrane, separating the male and female parts, and then with their thumb kind of moves the pollen to the stigma of the plant. So these the flowers are in sprays of up to 20 flowers. The flowers open for less than 12 hours a day. They have to be pollinated during that time. But in those sprays of 20 flowers, you usually get just 1 or 2 opening at a day. So you have to look at every plant and every flower cluster on it, and there'll be multiples of these flower clusters on a single vine. So you have to look at them, go through and look at every single one every day, look for the ones that are newly opened, pollinate them, but you only pollinate about 5 or 6 of that whole spray, because if you pollinate too many, you'll get too much seed production and you'll get inferior pods. So you can only pollinate so much. So every day you have to do that. So then also when you harvest the vanilla pods, you have to get them while they're just becoming ripe. And that's right as each pod will start to separate at the end, but just start to. And they'll do this same thing as the flowers. You got 1 day basically, 1 or 2 days where it's at the right stage. If it opens too much, it's not as good. It's still sold, but it's cheaper. The producers, it didn't grade it as highly. So it has to be harvested on a daily basis. So just as it begins to split at the end is where they open it. Where they harvest it. So, daily hand pollination, daily harvesting, all very manual, nothing mechanical about it. And then it gets difficult. So, first you take these pods, which you've just harvested, and almost immediately you have to, what they call kill it, which is where you stop, you kill the vegetative state, which starts some enzyme processes, which really gives it that great smell. It can be done by putting in hot water, freezing, scratching it, which will start a different reaction in here, but it's a very specific method, or putting it in an oven, or in some areas where you can't do that, putting it out and spreading it out in direct, real blazing sunlight. Then after you've done that and started that enzymatic process, you sweat them, which is where you keep the fruits for 7 to 10 days in these packed in wool blankets, real densely stacked. They put them in bunches, wrap them in wool, stack them, and they what they call sweat them, where you get your temperatures go up to 150 degrees, between 110 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and high humidity during that week and a half. Then you have to dry them because you don't want that much moisture in them. So you want to get them down to 25 to 30% moisture so they don't rot, and that locks in the fragrance. So you get that by some exposure to air. So usually they're kept shaded or closed up and then brought out for certain periods in sunlight and fresh air. So sometimes they're laid out in the mornings and then packed back up in the evenings. And again, they do that for 3 to 4 weeks of doing this kind of back and forth. And then you condition them by storing the pods for 5 to 6 months in closed boxes where the fragrance really develops. And then they are graded for quality, and that's based on length, on aroma, on size, on appearance, on all these things. So to get this pod is this incredibly labor-intensive process that almost every step of the way you have to handle these and do things with them. So really important. And then to top it all off, soil. This is one of those plants where they talk about the terroir like they do with wines. The soil is so important, the moisture, the humidity of the air, the fertility of the soil, how they mulch them is all really, really important to growing good vanilla pods. So when people talk about, that's kind of, you taste this kind of vanilla, or when you get vanilla ice cream and they're like, oh, why don't you want, cherry butter brickle pistachio, you could say I want an exotic flavor because it really is. The Aztecs, the pre-Columbian Mesoamericans cultivated and used it with chocolate, with cacao in things. The world production of vanilla is about 8,000, a little over 8,000 tons. So, think about that. That's compared to, 1.2 billion tons of pepper. So in Madagascar grows almost half of that, with Indonesia in kind of the next spot. And unfortunately in Madagascar, this is really why it's the part of the reason the forests are just going away. There are different kinds. There's the bourbon vanilla, and that's really named because it was grown in the Spice Islands, specifically Réunion, which was when the French had control, was Ile Bourbon. So it doesn't have actually any bourbon in it, even if you get the vanilla extract. It's not bourbon, it's from Bourbon. So that's always vanilla planifolia, the original one. So that's kind of the most common ones. Mexican vanilla is that same species, Vanilla planifolia, grown in Mexico where it's native. And Tahitian vanilla is from, mostly made with Vanilla tahitiensis from Tahiti. Although that's what it's called. It seems like it's actually most of what's out there is a hybrid with planifolia and another species called odorata. And it's still being grown. It's a great species. But it's even more difficult to prepare, so it's grown by fewer growers, and it's often much more expensive. And then there's West Indian vanilla, which is Vanilla papona, grown from the Caribbean and Central and South America. So there you go on the different ones. The most common ones you see are the bourbon or bourbon, and the Tahiti, although the Mexican type is becoming more and more prevalent as people are more interested in where things come from and them coming from, where they originated. So if you say, well, vanilla is expensive, despite the fact that it takes forever to actually get from there to market, so I'm going to get, naturally flavored artificial vanilla. Natural flavoring. That much of that comes. Some of it is just pure chemical, hocus pocus. But some of that comes from a product called castoreum, which is the exudate from the castor sacs of mature beavers. And it has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a food additive, as a natural flavoring in the product's list of ingredients. So that's just a little taste about where these came from, and they really did shape, Europe and the Indonesia and Asia, and the Americas, in large part because this is what colonialism was all about in many cases. When you hear Dutch East India Company and places like that, there was tea and rubber, but the spice trades are really what sent all these explorers out. So great that way, but it was also, what caused a lot of still lingering issues around the world, really trying to control the flow of these and control the market and control the people who were the ones actually doing the producing of them. So, there's a bit of a yin and yang with the benefits and whatnot of the spices. But it did, in the U.S. that's what Columbus was looking for an eastern route, a western route to the Spice Islands. Got here by mistake, but that is what has really driven during that age of exploration was really much of it was spices. Now I do want to give one little warning about spices that actually somebody just really brought to my attention with a great Consumer Reports article. In a lot of spices, there is quite a bit of heavy metals. Lead, arsenic, cobalt, that can be really damaging. So, be careful. None of these were ones that were really tested, except for, I think, black pepper was, and the black pepper was all fine. They didn't test, Consumer Reports didn't test any that was a problem. But some other things can have enough in what would go into a single recipe. Now, not a single serving necessarily, but a single recipe, like say half a teaspoon, 3/4 of a teaspoon, that would be considered potentially harmful to a child and in some cases adults. So you have to be really careful. And one for me, I'm not an herbal supplement person, but I have been taking turmeric for joints, which really seems to work well for me. But you need to keep in mind, there is some oversight of spices by the Food and Drug Administration, probably not as much as there should be after reading the Consumer Reports article, but dietary supplements like turmeric capsules and things like that do not have those same restrictions that food has. So, you could be taking very high concentrations of something. So it's something to be aware of and keep in mind as you're doing this. But, really what I hope you take away is not so much that, but that there's a story behind all of these individual spices. There are people who, were instrumental in figuring out how to use them. In most cases, that's not recorded because it's indigenous peoples. But there are people who brought them, traded with them. There are people who faked spices and, got big payments and left people with stuff that wasn't very useful. So there's a whole lot behind these plants that I hope while you're cooking, you think about a little bit, that there's a lot there. So I'm happy to answer any questions online or in person if people have them. If you have a question here, just raise your hand and we'll address them. If you have them online, Chris may have already answered, or I'm happy to.
We do have one online one, not really involved in plants, but Sandy was just wondering what your thoughts on salt are.
So the question was, what are my thoughts on salt? Pro. Good on chips and fries. Salt is responsible in large measure for the ability to go travel around and find these spices and the age of exploration and movement of people, because it was a way to preserve foods. So it was really critical. These ships that went out for these spices and salt is really a mineral, not a spice. The folks that went out with salted meats and those kind of things. So salt was really important to be able to do that. And of course now it's a great flavor enhancer. Too much of it give you high blood pressure. Luckily that doesn't run in my family too much. So I do like salt on things. I don't know if that answered the question on my thoughts on it, but
Just general.
Any questions here in the audience? Oh, we got
one question. Hold on, we'll get a mic to you.
Will you go back to the piper vine for a moment? If it gets in the sun and produces those flowers, will edible peppers?
So, okay, will edible peppers on this hardy piper vine form? I will assume that that if there is something here in the U.S. Where we're talking about, will pollinate it, or if you get out there and try to pollinate it yourself, that fruit will form. And I have seen on pepper plants grown in conservatories, Piper nigrum grown in conservatories, I have seen fruit on them, and those, presumably were not pollinated, so they will produce some by themselves, I think. I don't know, though, if Piper cadsura is edible. If I didn't know about the star anise being toxic, the other species being toxic as compared to Illicium verum, I'd say it's probably fine, but it might not be. So I would not eat it without doing further research on that. But there may be good research out there on what is and is not edible fruits. Yeah.
We have another online question, Mark. Juiced has asked, regarding peppers, and peppers is in quotes, are there any special xanthoxylum species at the JCRA that you can recommend?
Oh, great question. Xanthoxylum is the fruit, the seed of which gives the really distinctive flavor, specifically to Sichuan food. It's some species are known as Sichuan Pepper, and I love that flavor. It's spicy, but kind of bright, and man, I love it. And there are some fairly hardy ones that we don't have any here right now. I wouldn't mind growing it, and you can get the fruits to form here, is my understanding. It is it's a great flavor. If you're here in the Raleigh area, there's a great Chinese restaurant, a great Sichuan restaurant, not just Chinese, Sichuan restaurant called Chengdu 7. Chengdu's the capital of Sichuan. And as long as you stay away from the I forget what the page they call it, the page that has General Tso's chicken. If you stay away from that and get the other things, and you get it at least moderately spicy, which is pretty spicy, you'll get that Sichuan pepper in there. The beef hot pot. It's a dry hot pot. Ugh. Ordered it once Sichuan hot when my family was out of town. Whew. It's good stuff. Good for a diet. You can't eat much of it.
Any more questions in here? We don't have any on the chat. Well, that's looking like about it, Mark. Thank you so very much for the great talk about holiday spices. We really appreciate it. And thank you, volunteers, for everything that you do.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was fun, and we will get back to plants you can actually grow soon. I just thought this would be a fun topic for us all. So thanks for joining us in person and online.